Now, is
You can't move your chair back or forward.
You can't bump the computer either, Hannah.
well, I can't do anything to the computer. If I move my chair back, we lose more of me.
Right.
If I move my chair forward,
right.
I end up sort of actually in the computer. No, I can't improve it. Dennis, is anybody else waiting to get on?
No, that's it, I think.
Where's Dorothy gone?
Oh, she's there, but she hasn't got her video on at the moment.
Oh, right. Right.
Just see if I...
Well, if the worst comes to the worst, your video could go up and we'd just hear you speaking.
Oh, look, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You know, actually seeing someone's face is not the be-all and end-all. Okay, so I think we should start. Time is going by, and it doesn't look like anybody else is joining us today. So I'll welcome everybody and acknowledge that this Zoom talk is hosted from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future. And we also acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. Dennis will be recording this talk and discussion. So if for any reason you would rather not be seen in the recording, then just turn your video off. I think that's the only sort of housekeeping messages I have. So it's just now to welcome Seamus to speak to us again, which is a great pleasure, particularly after the first talk we had, which was very lively and interesting. And he's going to talk today around the question of, is China imperialist? So over to you, Comrade Seamus.
Thank you very much, Comrade. Are we recording now? Yeah, I see we are. Brilliant. So to start with, I'll quickly recap some of the main points of the last talk, so we're all on the same page. So I think 8 points can be made. That sounds like a lot, but it'll make sense. Firstly, I think we should understand when Lenin talked about imperialism, he was first of all talking about a stage of history, a stage of capitalist development. He wasn't primarily concerned with the question of, you know, is X country imperialist or not? So that's the first point, is that when he was talking about imperialism, he was primarily talking about it as a stage of capitalism. Now, second point, does that mean that it's meaningless to talk about X country as imperialist or not? Of course not. It is meaningful to say that, although we should perhaps be precise in saying this country is an imperialist power or not, rather than this country is imperialist or not. Because if we're following Lenin's understanding of imperialism, we're thinking of imperialism as a stage in the history of the development of capitalism throughout the world. So if we're following this understanding through, it's a bit strange to talk about this or that country being imperialist or not. But it still makes sense to talk about this or that country being an imperialist power or not. We understand that imperialism means that in international capitalism, there are structures of power relationships between countries where certain countries are more powerful in the international system of imperialist relations than others. So, you know, it's kind of a fiddly point, a nitpicky point, but it's important to understand these distinctions. So then 5 points I'll do in one are the 5 points Lenin gave as the characteristics of imperialism as a stage of capitalism. And he said, number 1, the concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Number 2, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, and the creation on the basis of this finance capital of a financial oligarchy. Number 3, the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance. Number 4, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world among themselves. And number 5, the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. And I think all these points are very important. For instance, point 1 emphasizes the importance of monopoly domination of imperialist capitalism as a key feature of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, as the final stage of capitalism that creates the conditions for its destruction. But also point 3 is particularly interesting when we are considering questions of, is this or that country an imperialist power? Because he says the export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. So let's think more closely, look more closely at the idea of the export of capital. I think it's interesting the way Lenin uses this idea, because in a way, it's the opposite of the bourgeois economic concept of export versus import. I think in bourgeois economics, they would look at the sort of relationship Lenin is talking about when he says the export of capital as actually being import. They would say that what we would call imperialist powers are importing capital in the same relationships as we would say they're exporting capital. Because what Lenin is talking about is the accumulation of capital, finance capital particularly, in highly advanced, highly developed, highly wealthy capitalist powers, this accumulation leading to an overabundance of capital within the domestic economy of these nations, and then the export of that capital, the export of that finance throughout the rest of the world, and attaining super profits through this export. So actually we're talking about what bourgeois economists would just rather tamely call foreign investment by capitalist powers into the developing world. Foreign export of foreign investment, which is a rather friendly, neutral concept where we're investing in overseas, investing throughout Asia and Africa, this and that, sounds rather neutral, sounds perhaps positive, but really it's actually the export of the finance capital of the most advanced imperialist powers to the rest of the world, and actually receiving in turn super profits, you know, exploiting entire nations, entire developing nations through the position of a few countries as extremely wealthy, relatively, imperialist powers. So that's 7 points. I said there were 8 points, and there is an 8th point, but I'll get to that maybe. So we'll move on to China, because the main topic here is China, the question of China. And in my last talk, I raised China as a sort of peripheral question, but people responded very positively to it and wanted to hear more. I said that according to the definitions that Lenin gave, one couldn't possibly say that China is imperialist or is an imperialist power. It wouldn't make sense to do so, but instead that viewpoint relies on a more naive interpretation of imperialism, of the notion of imperialism. And it's one which is out there and is being used by mainstream media almost entirely against China. They have no other interest in using the concept of imperialism, because, you know, if you talk too much about imperialism, it's pretty obvious who the main imperialist powers are. They don't want to talk about that except when they can use it against their enemies. So there's no coherent understanding of imperialism being developed in mainstream media. They only use it as a term to attack China, Russia, these sorts of countries, and aim to discredit them amongst people like us. So we have to be better than that. We have to clearly know what we mean when we use words like this. So in particular, I raised point 3 as a particularly important point. The export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. I don't think it requires a lot of thought to establish that this cannot be said of China. You know, the export of commodities is by far the most important aspect of the Chinese economy when it comes to external relations. But there is a more complex point, and it's rather interesting. I've looked at the way the CPA-ML has analysed some of these things, and seeing that only a couple congresses ago for them, they had clearly analysed things basically the same way as I am doing now. They had said clearly that China cannot be considered imperialist or an imperialist power because of these exact 5 principles Lenin laid down. But they've sort of moved away from that now. I won't go into why I imagine that is, but they have advanced the proposition, and we see other groups doing it too, that whether or not China is now an imperialist power, it is supposedly on a path to being so, because they claim that tendencies or trends in the development of the Chinese economy and its relationship with other countries is pointed in the direction of it becoming an imperialist power. And I think the discussions around this are more interesting and more complex. And of course, what is most often raised is the question of China's relationship with Africa and African countries specifically. Now, it is very worthwhile to investigate these things in detail because actually they reveal so much positive work that China is doing on the international stage. Despite the fact that many are using China's strengthening relationships with Africa as an opportunity to attack China and to say that what's going on is some sort of imperialism or some sort of neo-colonialism is the word that is often used. But when we actually look at what's going on, now the simplest thing to point out is that African countries, many African countries, are seeing what China is offering them. Now they have pre-existing relationships. Almost all African countries, actually all African countries, have pre-existing relationships with various European powers, and in some cases the US. They are seeing what China is offering them. They are weighing up these options, and they are overwhelmingly now moving over to relations with China, stronger economic relations with China. And it's kind of strange to see all these Western newspapers come out with claims of Chinese neo-colonialism in Africa and saying they're engaging in financial exploitation of Africa, when even if that were the case, it has to be objectively observed that whatever financial exploitation is going on, it is less severe than what Europe and the US are offering Africa. And once you sort of realize that and realize that what's happening between China and Africa is being misrepresented by Western powers which wish to perpetuate their stranglehold on Africa and their absolute control over Africa, it's quite amusing, really, that they would come out and say China's coming in and trying to exploit Africa, and we know that because they're taking business away from us. It's quite funny, really. I've seen a lot of discussion going on amongst African politicians and activists online talking about all these things, and you know, the manner in which China is investing in Africa is of a completely different nature to the way European powers and the US, etc., have engaged in Africa. You know, over the past 100 years, there were basically zero railways or any sort of transportation projects between African countries carried out with or without the assistance of any lovely, friendly European or other Western power. But suddenly, China, now that it has the capacity to provide assistance to the rest of the world, it's already giving a better life to its own people. Now it can come out and give help the rest of the world. It has come to Africa and is funding all these sorts of projects. You know, it's creating transportation networks and economic relations across Africa, which promote the economic development of Africa by their own means. And it reminds me of something Thomas Sankara, the socialist leader of Burkina Faso for a few years in the 80s, he said after he rejected all French aid, they were offering lots of grain and that. And Thomas Sankara said that if they really wanted to help Africa, if they really wanted to help Burkina Faso, whatever, they would not be offering grain. They would be offering tractors. They would be offering capital, in a way, you know. They would be offering things that allow these countries to become economically self-sufficient and not reliant on outside aid. And that is exactly what China is offering. They are building up these economies to operate independently, and they are offering a way out of the domination of imperial powers. It's interesting to think about some of the differences in the ways China carries out this sort of international assistance to the way the Soviet Union did, because it is different. You know, the Soviet Union promoted the concept of no obligation aid. They would simply give aid to other countries and there'd be no obligations whatsoever. And, you know, that's a lovely thing. That is a lovely thing. And China doesn't quite do that. They have a different concept that they're promoting, and that is win-win cooperation. So they're promoting this idea because China is a developing country. They don't have the same sort of resources that even the Soviet Union did, you know. It's easy to look at China and think, if you look at certain big cities like Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, and you think this is practically a developed country, but that isn't the case for the whole country, you know. It is still a developing country, very much so. So they don't have exactly the resources to do the same sort of aid that the Soviet Union did. And the idea they're promoting is that cooperation between different countries should be on the basis of mutual benefit always. Because that is something that all countries are in a position in one way or another to provide. And the fact that they, with their perhaps significantly greater international influence than most countries, are promoting is an excellent thing for the development of international relations throughout the world. So when we look at claims that China is imperialist, it is instructive to look at how similar claims were made in the past about the Soviet Union, and understand the political nature of these claims and how they're relevant to us, how we should understand them. Because ironically, it was China itself which was the most vocal promoter of the concept that the Soviet Union was a social imperialist country, but in the period of left opportunism of the late Mao period. So they heavily promoted this idea at the time, and they were largely mistaken in this regard. It is interesting to think about, you know, I don't think in that period they developed any sort of coherent concept of what social imperialism in this context means. The idea that a country could be socialist and imperialist is not one that any communist supports, but it's one which is very favorable to anti-communists. If they can demonstrate that you can be a socialist country and an imperialist country in some sense, that heavily supports anti-communist ideas. And unfortunately, the left opportunist tendencies, which became quite widespread in the international movement in the sort of 60s, 70s, sort of gave a lot of voice to this idea. Of course, they weren't actually suggesting that a socialist country could be imperialist. They were suggesting that the Soviet Union was no longer socialist and was actually somehow secretly capitalist and imperialist. Perhaps they didn't express it clearly in those terms because it becomes quite ridiculous when you really think about it openly in that regard. I mean, we know very well that whatever faults accumulated in the Soviet Union over the years, it's quite clear from what came after that the Soviet Union continued to be socialist for its entire existence. But it's very easy in the West particularly to say, I support socialism, but X country that's our enemy isn't really socialist, and I'm the one that's really socialist. You know, it's a lot easier to believe ideas like that. But our party has always sailed a clear course through these obstacles and has always applied a deeper level of analysis. And we continue to understand that the Soviet Union was a socialist country. Now, if it were the case that a socialist country could be imperialist, then that would cause serious, cause us to have to completely redefine what we mean by either of those terms. And none of that is warranted by the facts. So really what the claim of social imperialism, or of a supposedly socialist country being supposedly imperialist, what that really serves to do is actually promote the idea that it's not socialist by attacking it on a simpler level. Because I think the question of imperialism is in some ways a less thorny idea because of the prevalence of naive conceptions of what imperialism is than what the question of whether a country is socialist. So complex ideas here, but what we should understand is that the consequences of the widespread promotion of the idea that China is imperialist without developing a coherent understanding of what imperialism is that the right wing, now they don't care about these issues. They know they don't like China. they know they don't like, you know, any enemy of the Western political agenda, regardless of what its specifics are. But it also is targeted against the Western left and has been incredibly successful at pulling large sections of the Western left away from support for China, which should otherwise be its natural position in these circumstances. I mean, even groups which don't support the concept that China is socialist should oppose the concept that China is imperialist. You can simply not really find a concept of imperialism that justifies that beyond the most naive interpretation of the concept, without accepting lies that are promoted by mainstream media. And we should all be above that. So it's very important that our party continues to apply a higher level of analysis to these things, according to Marxism-Leninism, than do, you know, any other forces in Australia. It would be lovely to see a widespread rejection of the narratives being promoted in our media, and we can be a force to push for that. But I think recent developments have demonstrated quite clearly that in these circumstances of extremely intense anti-China propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, we're basically about to return to 50s level of Red Scare nonsense in our media. We are the only party capable of seeing through it, of having the theory, having the ideology to see the truth of the matter. And I'll leave it there for now. We'll open up to discussion.
Very interesting topic here. Very, very interesting. Yeah.
Comrade Hannah, you're on mute.
Ingrid, were you talking then?
Yeah, I was saying very interesting topic. Very actually clarifying thing, you know.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from comrades? Is someone talking? If so, can they turn their volume up?
I'm good.
I was very interested in you pointing out that the mainstream media is targeting the left on this about China. Not that I found that very interesting. I'm watching the ABC Media Watch last Monday night. They had about the Chinese, the 2 Australian journalists that were that came home suddenly, you know, and yet they never mentioned the fact that in June of this year, Australia expelled some Chinese journalists, and that wasn't mentioned. And I expect the ABC to look for these sort of things, not just to repeat the stuff that we're going to hear anyway from other places. And I was quite disappointed for once in Media Watch. And even while they were talking about it, their graphics at the back were, you know, the Chinese army marching and things like that. So they've fallen into the same trap of automatically thinking, you know, it must be China's fault.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Are there other comments or questions from participants?
I'd just like to say, Seamus, it was really interesting. It's given me a lot to think about. I don't know if I've reached the conclusions yet, but I mean, the whole mainstream media attitude, it's almost like what they don't say. It's like the elephant in the room. Like we all know China's bad, so we won't say it. Although their diplomatic skills have got us in the current trading predicament, if they'd like to have a good look at themselves.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very interesting and it's very topical. Yeah, and no one ever says American imperialism in the mainstream media. It makes you laugh. That's normal. That's good.
Yeah, I think
not
that's good.
exploitation in Africa. That's helping them out.
Yeah, it's a good
very,
point.
very interesting topic. Thank you.
Yeah. Who'd like to go next? Ahmed?
Yes, comrade, good evening, and sorry being late because I just look at my emails, but if I had received the link for Zoom earlier, I could remember that. However, apologize for being late, but in regard to China being an imperialist country, I am opposed to it because imperialist, as we had discussion last meeting, or last session, which Comrade Seamus was explaining, it's got some criteria. And China, despite having economic relation with the Western countries and exporting capital, etc., but is not an imperialist country because one of the clear things of the imperialist distinction is they are invaders, they are occupiers, they are making wars with the neighbors, with the whole world. You know, China is not one of them. China hasn't, since Comrade said that during the time of Vietnam War or whatsoever, which was some rivalry among the socialist bloc, you know, Chinese bloc and the Soviet bloc, China hasn't invaded or made a war for so many years, you know, if you want centuries, you know. China always has been invaded, China has been attacked by the Japanese, by the Yangs, by the Palms, etc., etc. However, to say that China is an imperialist country is a joke, you know. And because our administration, our government, you know, everything is intervened with the Uncle Sam and the other Western imperialists, despite being dependent on the Chinese economy, you know, which is very close to us. They are making trouble in the South China Sea and other parts of the world and following what the Uncle Sam says, which is not good for the Australian people. Australian people should have an independent role when there are two powerful countries against each other or whatsoever, you know. Chinese people have nothing to do with this situation. They like to work, they are hard-earning people. They try to be friends with everybody. All the deals they make is win-win with the third world country. They rode the new Silk Road, which is has got a different name now. Has got more than some say 62, some say 80 countries have joined it. You know, and then. The reasons Uncle Sam is trying to make trouble for Australia because they don't want to let this Silk Road, you know, to go its way smoothly. So far, they have lost. They have to accept that they have been in a bad situation. They have to get away and look after their own people rather than making trouble with the other countries like China, Iran, Russia, or North Korea, you know, Cuba, you know. Whatever they do just is to make sanctions, blockade, and all sort of things. They are just will make themselves isolated. You know, the Americans will do these things and eventually their friends like Australia will be isolated, which is not good for the Australian economy, Australian people, Australian, you know. However, telling China is an invader, an imperialist, expansionist, etc., etc. This is all things which are Uncle Sam and all other Western imperialists. China, because economically is improving and bypassing American #1 position, that's why they are making trouble for China. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
However, for us Australians, must be friends with our neighbors. China is one of them. Our economy is rely on them, depending on them. We have to make it stronger, not to make enemy, not to be stooge of Uncle Sam and do whatever they tell us. We have to look after our own national interest. We don't need the protection from Uncle Sam or other imperialist countries. Australian people, despite being very little, they can defend themselves against the invaders. We don't need this protection. This is all to do with the surrounding of China in the South China Sea, not to allow them for their shipment of their economy, cargo ships, to the neighboring countries. They have failed so far. Anyway, thank you very much from everyone. Sorry for being late again, but it's not my fault. I tell to Comrade Dennis to send the link earlier so that we prepare. Anyway, thanks very much. Have a nice evening.
Okay. Comrade Ahmed, apologies that the link may have been sent a little late. Unfortunately, Dennis was in the hands of the doctors who don't let go very easily, as everybody knows, and didn't get home until much later than he intended, and then we sent out the link as quickly as we could. So we apologize that we made you late. Comrade Seamus wanted to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something Comrade Ahmed pointed out. Someone last time raised it as a criticism of something I omitted, and I've done it again, but now he's reminded me of it. Discussion of the link between imperialism and militancy and war. Now, the reason why I've tended towards omitting that incorrectly, sort of, is because part of the point I'm making is that there is a naive conception of what imperialism is, that is just a sort of vague tendency towards militancy, towards some undefined concept of military aggressiveness. But even if I will oppose that conception, it's equally important to understand that there is a direct link between imperialism and military aggressiveness. And that's really an objective factor in the development of international relations and wars, and that it's an extremely important factor, and it's something that I've missed out a little bit in what I've been talking about. So it's very important to understand that imperialism, which is as Lenin said, the highest stage of capitalism, but also the declining, the moribund stage of capitalism, where capitalism has exhausted its potential to progress the development of production in an effective way. And in order to keep sustaining itself, it needs to, in rather, and this is an old-fashioned word, but I'm using it out of sort of the context of Marx, in a primitive way, expand the scope of exploitation and of capture of resources and that sort of thing. And the simple way to do that is through war, through violence, through aggression against the rest of the world. And that's what we see imperialist powers doing. And as Comrade Ahmed pointed out, this is actually not what China does in any way, despite the fact that in order to promote the idea that China is imperialist, we've seen promotion of ideas surrounding China's alleged aggressiveness. But all of these fall apart upon investigation. And I think the one that's been particularly promoted lately is the question of the South China Sea. And you know, we know the imperialist propagandists are good at their job. They can find the most effective thing to attack, because China's claims in the South China Sea are very controversial, are very debated. But when investigating the facts of the matter, now what's clear is China's claim in the South China Sea, that is a very old claim. It's not a recent development what's going on there. What is a recent development is that China has developed to the stage where it's able to assert its pre-existing claims. China's territorial claims in the South China Sea predate the revolution. They come from the old Republic of China before the revolution. They've had the same claims ever since, except for they ceded part of it to Vietnam in, I think, the early 50s, or maybe even right after the revolution. I'll have to check that. But they actually ceded part of the claim that the Republic of China had already had to Vietnam, and since then have basically retained the same claim there. So when we look at that situation, China's not actually engaging in any sort of aggression there. They're simply enforcing a claim they've always had, so long as the People's Republic has existed. And the fact that it's the US who is most loudly criticizing them, criticizing their actions there, is hilarious, because, I mean, if China has no right to have warships in that sea, what right does the US have? It's incredible. And they're now sailing their warships within 12 or so kilometers of Chinese-held islands. I mean, that's an obvious aggression. And they're obviously creating a situation where they can start a war at any time. You know, it's a Gulf of Tonkin situation. We know the US will happily fake an incident at sea in that very region, because that's how the US got involved in the Vietnam War. They faked an incident not very far from there in order to justify their involvement in Vietnam. And they have created the exact situation where they can do the same against China whenever they please. So the claims of Chinese aggression there just do not hold up, and I think any other situation is an even weaker argument.
Dorothy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Sorry, have I got? Am I on sound? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I did. Thanks, Hannah. Shall I speak now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Look, thanks very much, Seamus, and you're obviously really well informed and have studied the theory, and I don't claim at all to have the expertise that you've demonstrated. So I'm going to try and make a couple of points as a devil's advocate, if you like, because I think they are relevant. The first point is that I think that when we're talking about China, we can't not distinguish between the Chinese state and the growing number of monopolies and multinationals that are of Chinese origin. And I think that's two different things. And it's very, very important, I think, if we're going to analyse China's political, economic, social development, we have to distinguish between them. And I think that's what people are on the left, because you referred to the fact that you thought that that parties on the left who are beginning to question China's position in the socialist world had been influenced by the capitalist mass media, etc. I think they're also probably considering and watching and studying the material conditions, the development of those monopolies and multinationals, and the role that they are playing in all around the world, not only in Africa. They're playing those roles all around the world. Now, you have a very tolerant, I think, attitude to it, and you're saying, well, they're the better of two evils. I don't want to go there. That's an argument one can make, but still, I think if we're going to make the kind of assessment that we're trying to make today, we really have to be talking, investigating a lot more, having a lot more facts, and really studying it very, very deeply. And I know that's not the point of this class, but I would say that that's an ongoing thing, that we will continue to do that as a party. We should continue to do that, because we have to know the role that different countries play in the world. But I think more importantly, I think we can go and debate, academically this question of whether China is imperialist or not, but I think it's a bit of an academic debate if our starting point is not to consider what's actually in Australia's interests. I think that's our starting point when in anything that we do. We have to consider what's in our interests, what's in the interest of the Australian people, of the Australian working class. I don't think to engage in, I think to what's in our interest, our starting point has to be that we're not going to take sides with China and the United States. That economic competition that's going on between them, it's not in our interests to be trying to establish, and nor are we capable of yet, because we haven't done the deep study, trying to establish, a side or try to take a side. I think from the Australian point of view, we have to say that for the Australian, we have to look after our national interests. That means we're not going to side with the US on its economic war on China, or its political war, or its military war on China. We're not going to side with them. That's not in our interests. That's not in Australia's interests. I think that's the position that we need to be pursuing, more than the academic debate about, is China imperialist, or is it moving from socialism to capitalism? That's a debate. That is a debate. I'm not saying we shouldn't study it, but I'm saying for our party, the important thing is to put a position that says we are pursuing our national interests, which are not aligning. We don't want to align. We don't want to align with the US. We don't want to align with anyone. We want what's in our, which is and China's saying this is what they want with their relations with other countries. It's cooperation on a mutually beneficial basis. Yes, so I think that's our starting point. I don't think until we've done the deep study, and I think watch this space, because I think more is going to be coming out about really what the material basis is. I think we have to distinguish between the Chinese state and the Chinese multinationals, who are playing a very negative role in some parts of the world. And I think the other thing, so I'll stop there, because I hope I've made those points clearly, and I hope I've added to what you've said, even though I don't, don't feel that I have anywhere near your level of knowledge and study and expertise. But there was one thing I did want to ask you. You talked about the 60s and the 70s and the left opportunism of the 60s and 70s. I recall that period, and so I need more explanation. But I recall that period pretty much a period of right opportunism, and a period of where Eurocommunism, where you know, we saw trends of right opportunism in the international communist world. I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I guess you may be referring to Australian domestic politics and the division in the CPA and the CPA-ML. I don't know, but I just wanted to raise that. Thanks.
All right, over to you, Seamus.
No worries. Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, specifically what I was referring to was in the Chinese context and in contexts around the world which were following the Chinese line at that time, following a left opportunist line. And it is important to recognize that there was also in the same time significant right opportunism, and it perhaps actually is correct to recognize the right opportunism as the more prominent issue of that period. So I think I didn't express myself quite clearly then. I think what happened in China there is interesting because they were reacting against they were particularly reacting against mistakes the Soviet leadership of that period made, right opportunist mistakes they made at that point. And right opportunist mistakes, including some more serious than the Soviet leadership made, were very prominent features of the struggles within the international movement throughout that period. So the Chinese leadership reacted to that, unfortunately in some cases by moving to the other end, but to also opportunist positions, but left opportunist positions. And we can learn so much from all of this. I think it does not serve us at all to look at any of what happened in that period in the international socialist community, in the international communist movement, to simply negate any of it, to simply denounce any of it without more well-considered thought and analysis. Yeah, that's my response to that exact question. So I was mostly talking about left opportunist tendencies in the Chinese leadership at that point, particularly in the later period of Mao's leadership. So Comrade Dorothy raised an excellent point about Australian interest in this matter. And this is really something very simple we can be expressing to people. You know, it is quite clearly, objectively in the interest of the Australian people to have good relations with our neighbours, and China is one of our neighbours. Even a section of our bourgeoisie recognises this and is right now causing significant contradictions within the bourgeoisie. And we can expect to see some rather interesting phenomena come out of that. But furthermore, it is in the interest of the Australian working class that we have good relations with China and with all our neighbours insofar as is possible. So I'd like to talk a bit about something Comrade Dorothy raised about monopolies and multinationals in China. I think it's important to see that the biggest monopolies and multinationals in China, and they do exist, but the biggest ones are state-owned. You know, if you look at the biggest companies in China of whatever form, overwhelmingly they are state-owned still. It's rather interesting to look at. And I often like to point out to people, because when people talk about the level of state ownership in China and talk about how the large private sector in China is an indicator that something has gone wrong there, you actually should investigate exactly why they've carried this out and exactly the reasons the Communist Party of China has given for the policies they followed and how well that corresponds to real material conditions. They actually advanced back in the 80s, I think around 86 or so, it might be a bit later than that. In the late 80s, they advanced the idea that for China's specific conditions, it was best for them to aim for a level of state ownership that would retain state ownership as the dominant force in the economy, and thus the planning of the whole economy would be possible still, but also gain the benefits of the market economy in developing the underdeveloped forces of production in China. And they said the proportion they expected would achieve that would be 30% state ownership, which of course was controversial at the time and continues to be controversial even within China as to whether that is accurate. You know, some people have advanced the idea that 50% it should be, or 70% it should be, and it's all up for debate. But they advanced back in the 80s the idea that 30% state ownership meant that the state economy, under the circumstances of the political system in China, would guarantee maximum benefit derived from the development of the market economy and non-state sector in China, as well as the strong state sector and the continuation of overall economic planning in China. And the level of state ownership in China is still above 30%. So even though they advanced this concept over 30 years ago, they've still maintained a higher level of state ownership in their economy than they advanced that theory, than the level that they advanced as a theory at that time. So there's no substance to the concept that there has been a tendency towards privatization in China. It really doesn't match reality, because they have been very clear on what their intentions are and what they hope to achieve. And when you look at what they have achieved, it matches very well. In fact, it exceeds their expectations of what they hope to achieve. So when we look at the real material conditions of China, it actually matches incredibly well exactly the hypotheses that the party there advanced, that they used to justify these very difficult advances in theory for their particular conditions, because they, of course, challenged a lot of widely believed dogmas at the time. And, you know, it's still difficult issues for us today. We need to understand what ways these developments do and don't affect us. I think in a lot of ways they don't affect us, because we have such vastly different conditions from China. You know, very little of the specific policies China has followed are relevant for us in our national context. But nonetheless, to understand their application in their context is very important for understanding the development of national characteristics of socialism, for understanding how it is to be developed under specific conditions, and yet still be part of an international movement towards communism.
Okay. Dorothy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd just add, thanks, Hannah. Thanks for giving me that opportunity. I'll just turn the video back on. Yeah, I actually think that, Seamus, I think that I think that we need to do a much deeper investigation. I don't know that the facts that as presented really confirm, that you've presented, they confirm a general picture. But I think we need a much deeper investigation of that picture and a confirmation of that, because I actually don't think that the biggest Chinese multinationals and monopolies are state-owned.
Do you have examples?
I would actually, I'd want that. No, I'm not trying. I'm just not. I think we need the facts and the figures, and it's not me. I'm just a little bit of doubt there about that, and I think all of us would benefit if we actually did the facts, looked at the facts and the figures. Yeah, I mean it's easy to talk generally, and I think that this. But as I said earlier, I think this is an ongoing issue that's not really central to what we need to be doing as a party, unless it requires us to take a position in the international communist movement. If that becomes an issue, then yes, we need to really, really think deeply and investigate really, really deeply. But at the moment, I think the main point there would be to unite we have to play our role in uniting the international communist movement. And so we have to tread very carefully, because you've alluded to some of the differences that exist, and they do exist. And I think we have to be respectful of them, tread very carefully, and really do our homework. Because it's not something you want to jump into without doing your homework. And I'm a bit older than you, Seamus, and I say that with deep humility, you know. But I've seen these phases about popularity of a particular country or a particular leader come and go. We've seen it with China many, many times. You know, I'm old enough to remember the Mao Zedong, you know, and the rah, 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 and, you know, all this stuff. So I'm more skeptical, I'm more cynical. I like to see the facts and the figures, and I would counsel all our comrades not to be carried away with generalizations about, you know, specific characteristics. Let's see it backed up. Let's see it backed up, because socialism, of course, in every country will be different. The way the party will develop, how it will, of course, that goes without saying. You know, Marx never said that was any, we all had to follow exactly the same militaristically like, you know, style of developing socialism. Of course, every country is different, every different stage of development, different particularities, different economic mix, everything. But that doesn't excuse, that can't be used as a way of just saying, well, don't worry about it because this is their particular characteristics. No, we still have to do our investigation. We still have to use our theory to look at the contradictions and to understand what's going on, really what's going on. And there are, you know, I think there is reason to be concerned. And so until we are absolutely sure we know that we've done our due diligence, we don't jump on any bandwagons. That's just my sort of lived experience, as well as my understanding of the theory.
Thank you, Comrade Dorothy. Yeah, Dennis, you had your hand up. I'm sorry, I didn't see you before.
Oh, that's all right. Thanks, Seamus, for your contribution, and also thanks to Dorothy. I think Dorothy is a little bit too hard when she's talking about what's in Australia's interests. When it comes to Australia's interests, if you saw a chart of the amount of things that China buys from Australia, you'll see that China is by far and away the most important trading partner with Australia. and that when there was a recession early in the 2000s, it was China that saved us. It's China's buying of iron ore at the present time is what's saving us. And and if you, the contrast is with the United States, that if there's ever an issue in the United States, for example, if the United States have a bumper wheat crop, well, the United States has no qualms in stopping us from selling to somebody else. They'll undercut us at the slightest touch. And with a bit of self-criticism for myself is that I watched this attack on China for about 3 or 4 years ago, and there were people on the left saying we should do something about it. And I used to say, look, China's big enough, so big that no one can really upset them. You know that they're, and I think that's an incredible mistake. You know, the attack on China is just, in Australia, is absolutely bizarre, and it is something that will reflect and influence and come and hit us as a Communist Party as well. It's something that we should think very, very hard about and resist. The Belt and Road Initiative that some of the comrades have talked about, you know, I think that has a lot going for it. You know, like the comparison with the United States, there's a book written by Chomsky, a very small book, and it said, what does Uncle Sam want? And the answer was, in about the last sentence of this little booklet was, it wants whatever valuable you've got. And so that's what the United States is like when it has a relationship with a lesser country. So yes, there are faults with China. It's not a perfect country, and yes, we should consider carefully whether we're pro-Chinese and anti-American and so on. And it's probably in our best interest to keep them both as friends. But somewhere along the line, the United States has pulled our chain and said, get stuck into China. And we've obeyed that. The government has anyway. And as a Communist Party and as a party that is concerned for the working class, for the good of the Australian people, we should reject this attack on China. All the stuff that's gone on is just scandalous, and you know, the attack on the universities because of these Confucius stuff, and so on. So every country goes in for soft diplomacy, and China's just one of them. And there's I think there is a lot, as Dorothy says, we should study it more closely, but I would come down very firmly on the side of China, and being more open and friendly towards China, not in any way subservient, but I think it's in our best interest to be friendly with both countries, and rather than what we have at the moment. So thank you.
Dennis, just clarification, that's what I was saying. I agree with you totally. I wasn't saying that we are anti-China.
Yeah, can I just
look? Hold on, comrades. We're well over our normal time, which is no problem because it's been fascinating. But I think we have to think about gradually drawing it to a close. So I'm going to hand over to Seamus so that he has both what he wants to say in response to what's been going on, but also then maybe to sum up a bit and get us to finish.
Yeah, no worries.
And
yeah,
take whatever time you need.
No worries. Yeah. But before Dorothy said anything, I was gonna say, I do agree with just about everything Dennis said. Then I think just Comrade Dennis may have misinterpreted a little bit about what Dorothy said. I think Dorothy was supporting the idea that we shouldn't, due to Australian national interest, objectively, we shouldn't support any extreme anti-China thing. And I think that's a very mature position. Regardless of anyone's view on questions of is China socialist or not, is China imperialist or not, stuff like this, regardless of that, we should be able to advance the idea that it's not in our interest, it's not in the world's interest to engage in the US promoted hostility against China, the way they're doing it. Now, of course, Comrade Dorothy and I have different opinions on China specifically, and so I think it's particularly valuable to see that we can nonetheless arrive at a similar conclusion in that regard. And that's very important because bringing that understanding to the Australian people is very important. I think, what else was I going to say? I think also something Comrade Dorothy pointed out, two things, was that we do need to think more about China. We do need to think more about the question of Chinese socialism, and simultaneously, and these can seem to be contradictory things, but really they form a unity, we also shouldn't think that this is the most important issue. We shouldn't think that this is determines the character of our party or anything like that. So simultaneously, we should take it seriously, and we should not be distracted by it. And to fuse these into a unity can be a difficult thing to get your head around, but it's important for us to do. Of course, Comrade Dorothy and I have different expectations as to the outcome of that process, but regardless, it's a valuable thing. You know, I know that I personally, from years ago before I joined the party, when I was learning independently about Marxism and that, I had arrived at a rather negative assessment of China. And what triggered me to have a closer look was I went to China. I went to China actually accidentally, almost, because I actually went to travel to North Korea. And to go there, you have to go via China. I wasn't even thinking about China. To me, it was, everyone knows China's capitalist now. Everyone knows that. And I wasn't even thinking about China, but I thought I'd go to North Korea. It's an interesting idea. But just a few days of being there sort of made me realize that I hadn't done my own investigation into these things in a real way. I had not done that. I had relied on other people's analysis, second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand. And certainly it wasn't the personal experience that changed my mind. I think personal experience of any given country is the weakest possible evidence. We as Marxist-Leninists, having a scientific approach to understanding the world, we have to look closer. We have to have a more comprehensive scientific analysis of the world. But it was that experience which triggered me to engage in a more in-depth analysis and led me to look at things more closely and to consider different arguments on the case. And that's something I think we already are all doing to some extent, and it's something we will continue to do and should have positive outcomes. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, comrades, thank you very much for another very interesting talk. And a special thank you to Comrade Seamus. I think we'll have to have you back again.
Yes, please.
However, our next talk will be on October the 21st. We're doing them now once a month for a variety of reasons. And it will be given by Comrade Nicole on identity politics and socialism. So I think that might also be a discussion that will provoke some responses. But above all, thank you to Comrade Seamus. We've had two very interesting discussions as a result of your contributions, and we'll make sure to exploit you again in the future. And to all comrades, as usual, stay safe, stay well, and keep up your activities in any way that is possible for you in these difficult times. Okay, comrades, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Seamus. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus.
Bye-bye.
See you.